Welcome to another episode of This Is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast, Season 4, Episode 12. Your safe space to discuss sports, politics, social issues, and even religion, where we will take it all very seriously, but not too seriously. What's on the slate this week? One thing that's not on the slate is going to be a prognostication of the NCAA tournament. I am going to save that an extra week. I'm going to have my buddy Brian on. We're going to talk a little NCAA basketball as well as preview the upcoming Major League Baseball season. What I do want to address is the alleged suicide of the Boeing whistleblower. Spoiler alert, I believe it's a suicide, folks. And I also want to delve into this Shohei Ohtani story with regard to his interpreter and the gambling debt of $4.5 million. The whole story is colored in shades of Pete Rose. Thank you all for listening. If you like what you hear, please give the podcast 5 stars, a thumbs up. Please like, please subscribe, write a review, send to friends and enemies far and wide. If you want to support the podcast, This Is Why I Don't Vote is on Patreon. Without further ado.
Act 1. Sometimes suicide is just that. The Boeing whistleblower found dead.
John Barnett is the Boeing whistleblower. The man worked at the company for decades and has testified in a number of different capacities, both as a witness to all of the different safety protocols, procedures that Boeing ignored, and also in a lawsuit against Boeing for retaliation. That retaliation lawsuit was the lawsuit that Barnett had testified for at least 10 hours, both in direct examination and cross-examination, and was scheduled to testify for an additional day before he allegedly shot himself and killed himself. Many people are disputing whether or not this was a suicide. The Charleston Police Department, where that deposition was taking place, the depositions were taking place in Charleston, South Carolina. The Charleston Police Department initially came out and qualified the death as a suicide by gunshot wound. Shortly thereafter, a family friend comes out and says there's no way he would have killed himself. He told me that if he was ever found dead and they were trying to call it a suicide, that was BS, that he would never kill himself. I've stated numerous times on the podcast that I don't want to speculate on events like this one, like someone's suicide, where all of the facts have not been publicly released. We don't know why the Charleston Police Department has initially concluded that it was a suicide. There's evidently a piece of paper that was found next to Barnett. It could be a suicide note. Many of the principals in Barnett's life said that he was very upbeat, that he was happy about where his cases, these cases against Boeing, had progressed to. He was happy to have an opportunity in his deposition to tell his side of the story. So we as a public are ready to jump to the conclusion that it was not a suicide, that somehow there was foul play involved, that Boeing, because they wanted to shut this guy up, was willing to pull a Michael Clayton, was willing to kill this man and make it look like a suicide. A couple things that I want to note about this story, and I feel like this is not being represented in not only the legacy media, but in social media as well. Let's start with social media. There isn't anything that we do in the 21st century that isn't represented out there in social media, and there isn't anything that we do in the 21st century that most of us don't post on social media. Many of the things that we say that we get in trouble for, and when I say trouble, I usually mean that there's public scrutiny over the things that we've said. How do we publish those? We publish those on social media. Many of the apologies that we make for things that we may have said or done are published on social media. In ruminating on this story, I consider someone like me who really doesn't enjoy social media, who would prefer not to be on social media at all, and but for the fact that I am still publishing this podcast and feel compelled to try to increase awareness so that I can increase the audience, I have social media accounts. So let's look at me instead of looking at the Boeing whistleblower. Let's look at someone that has very small or very little social media profile or presence. If something happened to me in my personal life or my professional life, and I felt that I was now the subject of scrutiny from a governmental entity or a private organization that had massive power, and that not only my financial well-being, but my physical well-being may be in jeopardy, the first place that I would go to express what was going on, to shine a light on what I thought might be this nefarious activity by these nameless, faceless entities, or more specifically, people on behalf of these nameless, faceless entities, I would go to social media. I would expect that other people would do the same. And that expectation has been matched or mirrored by all of the different people that, even in my limited exposure to social media, have gone on to tell, quote unquote, their side of the story. So John Barnett ends up dead from a gunshot wound, and a family friend immediately comes out and says, he told me that if anything ever happened to him, it wasn't suicide. I feel like that would have been something that a man under this type of scrutiny would express on social media, and would express namely to his attorneys. I recognize that none of us would ever expect that, based on what we did in our professional life for a number of years, that we would ever think that we would be subject to being murdered in order to keep us quiet. That's not something that we would just throw out. I'll throw it out right now, though. If I end up dead and the police rule it a suicide, that's bullshit. I didn't kill myself. See, that's how this works. And I don't have anything looming over me that I believe would warrant someone wanting to murder me. Having said that, I'll state for the record, if I'm found dead and it's ruled a suicide, that's bullshit. I didn't kill myself. Is it possible there was an accidental death situation? Maybe. But if there's a gun found next to me and there's a ruling of suicide by a coroner or a police department, I didn't kill myself. We really never know what is in someone's mind at every or any given moment. So even though Barnett may have seemed chipper, may have seemed excited in order to tell his side of the story as his attorneys set forth or put out in the media, we don't know what was going through his head the morning that he passed away. I would feel more comfortable if there were some proclamation on his own behalf, that he posted something on social media, that he had told more than one person that if I pass away and it is ruled a suicide, don't believe it. The second thing that I wanted to comment on is why now? Why would Boeing, and we're entertaining this scenario that Boeing had something to do with the man's death, why would Boeing do it now? This gentleman has testified and has given many, many hours of damning testimony about his time at Boeing and all of the safety procedures and all of the safety protocols that he witnessed, that he actually witnessed skirted while he was working at the company. So we're not talking about someone who has this wealth of information and has yet to divulge it. This man has been the center of scrutiny in this whistleblower case for a number of years. That's right, years, plural. And the testimony that he was giving that placed him in Charleston, South Carolina on the fateful day that he passed, this was testimony in a retaliation lawsuit against the company. He was testifying to not only the incidents that he witnessed of Boeing purposefully navigating through all of the safety protocols and procedures, avoiding all of them. I don't feel that that's an unfair qualification, that Boeing didn't just miss things, didn't just negligently go through their safety protocols and procedures, that it was purposeful. They knew what they were doing, the willful and wanton language. Barnett alleges, and it's very likely true, that when he brought these things to management's attention, that he was retaliated against. So you have both the willful and wanton conduct, this is the way we're going to do things, and if anyone complains about it, we're going to make an example out of that person, we're going to retaliate against them. It's further evidence, it's a further indictment that Boeing knew what it was doing. That's not a secret. We know all of this because Barnett's already testified to it. He's already put that out there. So from a timing standpoint, does it make sense? Does it make sense to you, dear listener, that Boeing, through its attorneys, would weave through the labyrinth, which is the discovery process in these lawsuits, would take these depositions, would have all of these facts be part of a public record, and then after it's all said and done, after the genie is out of the bottle, orchestrate some type of scenario where they could kill him? The depositions were recorded, so that testimony, it can be used by governmental regulators in order to prosecute a civil case or a criminal case against Boeing for all of the different safety procedures and protocols that they failed to follow. I believe that Barnett's estate can still pursue the retaliation claim, given that he's proffered most of the testimony that was necessary in order to move those claims forward. The timing just doesn't make any sense if we are entertaining the narrative that Boeing had something to do with this man's death. At this point, we don't have any information about the gun. Was it Barnett's gun? Was it his normal practice to carry that gun with him wherever he went, or at least to have it in his car? Was the piece of paper that was found next to him an actual suicide note? Or did it have something scribbled on it that would have indicated what his mindset was minutes, if not seconds, before he shot himself, if in fact it was a suicide? If we're entertaining that there was something nefarious about this passing, about this gunshot wound, and it turns out that this was Barnett's gun and it was his routine to carry it around with him, we are now talking about a much more complicated murder scenario, where you were disarming someone that potentially has the gun on them, using their own weapon against them. Barnett was found in his car. So that further complicates things. If there were someone else responsible for that gunshot wound, they would have had to have somehow disarmed Barnett, or at least had the gun, possessed the gun without Barnett's knowledge, shot him, and then placed it into the automobile without any forensic evidence that there was someone else involved. I won't deny that that's a possibility. I won't deny that it's possible that someone took the gun because Barnett kept it in his car, that he hadn't yet realized that his gun wasn't where he left it, and that this other person shot him and then left the gun in the car in a place where someone who had just shot themselves might have dropped it, and then also created and left a suicide note. No doubt, because of the public scrutiny over this case, the Charleston police will do a thorough investigation to determine if there was any foul play, if there was anything nefarious about what they are qualifying now as a suicide. For my part, I'm going with suicide. And as difficult as that is for some people to accept, it doesn't make a lot of sense at this point that Barnett feared so much for his life that he didn't publish something saying, hey, if anything happens to me, it wasn't a suicide. And in particular, that Boeing would take this drastic a step after the dam had already broken, after Pandora's box had already been opened. Does it not seem possible to you, dear listener, that someone who's gone through everything that this man has gone through for, I believe, at least 5 or 6 years, that they may take a drastic action in a moment of despair or despondency? And as great a movie as Michael Clayton is, it's not that easy to find someone that you can trust that's going to keep their mouth shut, that's going to go to the lengths of killing people on your behalf for money. Threats are one thing. Intimidation is one thing. Actually going through with it, that's a whole nother ball of wax. And to entertain that idea, just think about it, dear listener. What would that person who actually undertook, who went through with killing another human being that was such a liability to this company, what kind of leverage would that person have over the company? Go back to any mafia movie that you've ever watched. The people that are involved in many of the highest profile crimes, they immediately become targets themselves because now they have leverage over everyone else. They have this information that they can either leverage for money out of the people who need that information kept secret, or if they're ever caught for any other crime, they have this information to leverage to get out of jail free. It's their get out of jail free card. Time will tell. But at this point, I feel like tragically, this was a suicide.
Act 2. The Shohei Ohtani gambling matter is colored in shades of Pete Rose.
For the non-sports fans that are listening to this podcast religiously, I do appreciate your attention and your energy. This is going to be a sports-related piece, so if you're going to turn it off, you might as well turn it off now. Let me give you some background, though, so you better understand the situation, because it's one of those circumstances that bleeds over into popular culture and is far outside of just the world of sports. There's an athlete named Shohei Ohtani from Japan who is both a pitcher and a hitter. Yes, that makes him a baseball player. He is a prolific hitter and he is a prolific pitcher. Big guy pitches with power. Big guy hits with power. He also hits for average. He also pitches with finesse. A once-in-a-lifetime, a generational athlete. And given that he's from Japan, you now have this international flavor to the story that this athlete that's come from the Japanese leagues, can he make it in the major leagues, the big leagues here in the States? Not only does he compete in the big leagues, he's one of the better pitchers, he's one of the better hitters, so he's accomplished with a lot of fanfare. He went from the Anaheim Angels recently to the Los Angeles Dodgers. I'm not going to go on a rant about that. They paid him $70 million a year for 10 years. A $700 million contract. So to illustrate how accomplished this baseball player is, how high profile he is, how important his international presence is in both Asia and the United States, I could rattle off a number of statistics. I could rattle off some data with regard to social media presence or media presence in general. How about I just sum it all up with 10 years, $700 million. Shohei Ohtani, big deal. A scandal broke out this week whereby a bookie in the state of California, understand that gambling is still illegal in the state of California. I live in the state of Arizona. You see all of these different advertisements every 30 seconds for all of these sports books that are now legal in this state. It is not legal in the state of California. So you cannot bet online. You can't gamble with any of these websites. If you want to place a bet in the state of California, you very likely have to go to one of those casinos that's on an Indian reservation. Well, if something's illegal, of course, there's going to be a black market for it. So there are bookies. You can place bets illegally with bookies in the state of California if you want to gamble. There was a federal investigation for a bookie that was taking illegal bets in the state of California, and one of the names that came up was the interpreter for Shohei Ohtani. Evidently, the interpreter for Shohei Ohtani owed this bookie taking illegal bets $4.5 million. And Shohei Ohtani satisfied those debts by paying them allegedly directly to the bookie, and then perhaps not allegedly. Let's discuss the story in detail. So this story, it drops earlier this week, and Shohei Ohtani's camp, the Dodgers themselves, Major League Baseball, they all go into crisis mode. And it turns out that there's $4.5 million owed this bookie, and it's his interpreter that's allegedly placing these bets. In the prosecution's investigation, they found out that the debts had been satisfied. So someone owed up to $4.5 million, and that was satisfied. This guy made $4.5 million from taking illegal bets. So you've got a number of criminal implications, and you have a number of tax implications. Obviously, that money's not being reported to the IRS. Soon after this news comes out, this story comes out, Shohei Ohtani's camp, these are the people that handle his publicity, they organize an interview with the interpreter. And this interview is with ESPN. And the interpreter goes on in the interview to state that the debts, the gambling, it was all him. Ohtani had nothing to do with it. I don't know how much interpreters make, but I don't think they make millions of dollars a year. So after having run up millions of dollars in gambling debts, the interpreter reaches out to Ohtani and says that he needs help. And Ohtani, according to the interpreter in this interview, pays this bookie directly $4.5 million. ESPN begins polishing that story for it to air. Before that story can air, Ohtani's camp changes course. And instead of it being the interpreter placed these bets and Ohtani paid the debt for him, Ohtani's camp hires a law firm. The law firm comes out and says, this interpreter embezzled the money and there's a crime here, and that's all we're going to say right now. Let's recap the story very quickly. Shohei Ohtani, big deal. How big a deal? I believe his last contract with the Anaheim Angels was somewhere in the $300 million range. Maybe it was $250, $50 million here or there. His recent contract with the Los Angeles Dodgers, $70 million a year on average, 10 years, $700 million. That's how big a deal. Gambling is illegal in the state of California. A bookie is indicted by, I believe, federal prosecutors. It may be state prosecutors, but federal prosecutors, let's go with that. And in the investigation of this bookie, they find that he had received $4.5 million from someone satisfying gambling debts. This interpreter for Shohei Ohtani alleges that he was the one who placed the bets, that Ohtani graciously paid them all off, and then Ohtani's camp comes out and says, no, that's not true. There was embezzlement involved, and we are going to lawyer up. It's interesting that I'm commenting on this story juxtaposed to the story about the suicide, the alleged suicide. I'm going to say it that way right now, although I believe it was a suicide. The alleged suicide of the whistleblower in the Boeing case. If you take this story at face value, it's very possible then that the interpreter somehow embezzled money from Shohei Ohtani to fuel his gambling addiction. Yet in baseball and in sports in general, we have history that we can look back on of athletes trying to use people in their orbit, their proxies, to place bets for them, because in every sports league, and baseball in particular, it's illegal to gamble. It's particularly illegal to gamble on your own sport, and it is even more particularly illegal to gamble on your own team, the outcome of the games that you are participating in. I'm not going to speak to the reasons why it's particularly an issue in baseball. If you'd like to do some independent research, you can type into your Google machine, Black Sox Scandal 1919. Again, Black Sox Scandal 1919. More recently, though, you can type in Pete Rose gambling scandal. Pete Rose was a once-in-a-generation talent, an icon in the sport of baseball. And Pete Rose had his own, let's call them gambling satellites, in his orbit. He had people that were in his crew, as the kids would say, that would place bets for him so that he wasn't associated with them. And he did, in fact, bet on baseball, and many speculate he bet on his own team. Now, he eventually came out and said that he did bet on baseball, and if he ever did bet on his own team, it would be to win, that he never bet on his team to lose. Now, why is that important? It's a distinction without a distinction in terms of whether or not he broke the rules. But the reason why the rule exists is if you were betting on your own sport and you're betting on your own team, you have inside information and you may be inclined to throw the game. If you bet on your team to lose, you obviously can affect the outcome of the game, which affects the integrity of the sport. And none of these leagues want people to think that the outcome is predetermined or rigged. All of these proxies, these satellites in the Pete Rose orbit, eventually got caught for gambling. This being the late 80s and the early 90s, and gambling was illegal everywhere. Unless you were in Las Vegas, you couldn't place bets. Although he professed his innocence, Pete Rose was determined to have gambled through these proxies. He was determined to have broken the rules in baseball. And because of the Black Sox scandal, roughly 70 years prior, there were draconian rules in baseball about gambling. So Pete Rose was banned for life, and he maintained his innocence for decades. The focus of that story is usually on Pete Rose lying, claiming that he was innocent for roughly 30 years. The focus generally isn't on how he actually conducted himself, how he was actually able to place all of these bets, to do so under the radar for a long period of time. Pete Rose would have gotten away with gambling for years, but for the fact that many of the bookies that he was betting with and the people that were placing the bets, they ended up getting caught. They ended up getting prosecuted. And namely, the people that were taking bets for Pete Rose, namely the people that were placing bets for Pete Rose, they had something to leverage. The similarities in the stories, the overlap is, initially, these people did not come out and admit that they had any involvement with Pete Rose. They tried to keep all that they knew a secret. They tried to keep the entire scheme a secret. One of the things I communicate to people all of the time as an attorney is that the circumstances of any case, whether it's a civil case or a criminal case, you can work around as an attorney those circumstances. You can try to craft legal arguments to fit the facts as they stand. One of the biggest problems in the law, particularly for attorneys, is when people either don't tell them all of the facts or more likely they misrepresent the facts. And if someone misrepresents the facts, misrepresents things to federal prosecutors, to state prosecutors, generally the cases that are being brought against them are then shifted not only to whatever the underlying crime was, the allegations are, but the fact that you lied. And what you find is, many times, people are more compromised by the lies that they told than the underlying criminal actions that they undertook. Leverage applied by the prosecutors then becomes much greater based on the lies, not the underlying criminal acts. This Ohtani case reminds me specifically of things that I remember about the Pete Rose case, about one Pete Rose associate in particular that he used to place a number of bets. And this guy ended up being the linchpin of the case against Pete Rose, because when he just gave up holding out the information that he had, it was clear Pete Rose was guilty. And what was the main piece of information that he had that he could then validate what he was saying, that his story was actually true? Look at me, he said. Look at my life. Look at my income. Could I afford to place this number of bets for these amounts and continue to do so with these bookies? Would these bookies allow me to continue to place all of these bets for these sums of money and think that I was going to be good for it personally? That's a damning case to make. When you've got someone who's making, let's say, $80,000 a year in income. Let's say that they're making $140,000 a year. Let's say that they're making $340,000 a year. This is complete speculation. I'm not inferring that the person who ended up getting caught and turning on Pete Rose was making any of these salaries, but let's just throw out the numbers. $340,000 a year is a hell of a lot of money to make for anyone. You're in the top 1% of all income earners on planet Earth. Would a bookie allow you to run up a debt of $4.5 million if you were making $340,000 a year? How long would it take you to pay off that kind of debt to a bookie if you were making $340,000 a year? And I'm just pulling these numbers out of a hat. I mean, if you were able to take 50% of your income and put it towards your debt, how long would it take to pay off $4.5 million, applying $170,000 to it every year? Do you think a bookie wants to have a 10-year payment plan, a 20-year payment plan, a 30-year payment plan? Where Pete Rose's story went off the rails and where Shohei Ohtani's story goes off the rails is that this interpreter, who he had been close to for decades, the interpreter had been with him since he was playing baseball in Japan. There are stories coming out now where when Ohtani went to warm up and throw pitches, that his interpreter would catch for him. When Ohtani went into the outfield to warm up, he would play catch with his interpreter instead of with his teammates. That's how close a relationship these two had. That somehow this interpreter was able to run up debts of $4.5 million. Why would a bookie allow some guy like that to be able to run up those kinds of debts if he didn't think that there was a solid source of money behind him in order to pay that kind of debt off? Now, it's very possible that this interpreter embezzled the money from Ohtani, but it's curious that Ohtani's camp sets up an interview, and there's no doubt that there were people, public relations experts, that coached Ohtani's interpreter in anticipation of the meeting that they set up with ESPN for him to tell the story that he was a gambling addict and that Ohtani graciously paid off his gambling debts. So if this interpreter had embezzled all of the money from Ohtani, why would Ohtani then turn around and have his camp set up an interview to be on one of the largest sports broadcasting networks on planet Earth, that he was just graciously paying off the debts for someone that he was very close to who had a gambling problem and got in over his head? If it's embezzlement, you immediately come out and say, this guy stole $4.5 million from me. You certainly don't allow that person to go and tell their own story to the largest sports broadcasting network on planet Earth. If you have absolutely nothing to hide and you've already scheduled an interview for your interpreter to go on to the largest sports broadcasting network on Earth and tell that story, why do you then turn around and lawyer up and come out with a very short statement that this guy stole the money, providing very little additional detail? Shohei Ohtani, let's recall, big deal. 10 years, $700 million. The Los Angeles Dodgers, one of the marquee franchises in Major League Baseball, is heavily invested in Shohei Ohtani. Major League Baseball is heavily invested in Shohei Ohtani. All of Major League Baseball's broadcast partners, ESPN, ABC, Fox, these networks are all heavily invested in Shohei Ohtani. The entire nation of Japan is heavily invested in Shohei Ohtani. If he gambled through a proxy, baseball's rules are clear, and Pete Rose set a precedent. If any of those bets were on baseball, Ohtani would be banned for life. There are billions, with a B, billions and billions of dollars at stake over this story. There's a documentary series on Netflix about different sports incidents, all these nefarious sports incidents over time. And there's an episode about Donnelly, the NBA referee that ended up betting on NBA games, the NBA and David Stern, and how that whole scenario ended up playing out. And there is a strong inference, a strong implication that the NBA pressured the FBI to wrap that case up as quickly as possible, because the scandal that would ensue if Donnelly went to trial, that if he ended up having to testify, and his attorneys were able to examine witnesses, were able to call people from the NBA, namely the commissioner, David Stern, namely the head of the Referees Association, different individual referees, that would be a major scandal for the NBA. Do I believe it's above Major League Baseball to influence an investigation to salvage the reputation of one of its, if not its biggest star? Do I believe Ohtani's story that this interpreter embezzled all of this money from him after his camp set up an interview with ESPN to explain that the interpreter had a gambling problem and that Ohtani graciously paid off his debts? Do I believe that we're going to get an in-depth investigation from an entity like ESPN that is a business partner of Major League Baseball and stands to either profit or to lose out significantly, given Ohtani's stature in the sport of baseball, if Ohtani is in any way, shape, or form suspended? Where there's smoke, there's fire, dear listener, and we're going to be following that smoke for some time to come. This is Why Don't Vote, a podcast.